It was a wet Monday morning in Stockholm when I first started to reflect on Dr Ferguson's report of the 16th of March, which had sent the UK into lockdown. He made two key assumptions that had led to a prediction that 510,000 people would die if no measures were taken, and if a mitigation strategy were followed, 250,000 would perish. Only by means of full suppression would deaths be significantly reduced to 20,000. There were clearly problems associated with considering the epidemiological advice. The whole subject area was filled with complex scientific terms, and the report was packed with detailed tables, graphs and charts. The conditions were perfect for an indoor lockdown of my own to ponder the complicated matter. Figure this one out, Rayman. After some time mulling over the report, it became obvious to me that the matter could be boiled down to two relatively straightforward questions. Dr Ferguson made two major assumptions that underpinned his entire report. The first was that 80% of the UK population would become infected. The second, that of those infected, nearly 1% would die. Were they reasonable assumptions to have made? Because if they were, then that was the end of the matter. The advice was sound, and the government acted perfectly properly in locking down the country. So who was Dr Ferguson? Had any man in the history of the modern age, let alone an epidemiologist, wielded such power? I was now starting to properly line up the suspects, and becoming a little obsessive about it in the process, rifling about for a Cluedo set. The point of Cluedo is you do just time your suspicions, you actually kind of gauge the weight of evidence you've got in your hand. You got the Colonel Mustard off the list, you got the spanner that clearly wasn't the murder weapon, and it didn't happen in the hall. Now, you don't rush to a decision on who the murderer is and where the crime took place and what the murder weapon was until you've reviewed everybody on the board and you've pretty much eliminated all the options, so that it's a pretty fait accompli. It's a sort of a logical conclusion that a particular individual is the murderer. So let's not hurry to judge. Let's indeed set aside our own prejudices. We may have axes to grind where it comes to this issue. We may be anti-vaxxers. We may be censorship-free speechers. We may be, doctors. We may be amateur medics. We may be right-wing. We may be left-wing. We might be any range, we might have any range of prejudices. We may hate health and safety. We may want everyone to be, lives to be preserved at all costs. Whatever our prejudice, whatever we bring in, whatever acts that we have that we kind of usually grind in our ordinary lives, let's just park all of that and consider with a cool, oily head the evidence. Although it was an ordinary Monday morning, there was a curious tension in the air, and the simple sight of a helicopter above a building seemed somehow sinister. Before this situation, I don't think it would have had any effect,
No.
So what's that all about?
I don't know.
Because I felt it, and I just thought But you feel
I
it
felt
too?
it too. It was like...
I mean, it's just an ordinary old helicopter in the sky, isn't it? It's not,
it's not a big deal, but...
For some reason, it assumes
it is.
phantom proportions. I decided to take refuge from the inclement weather in a department store and mused over the report. The smaller circle was a severe flu season with an infection rate of 20%. The larger circle was an equally well-known but more highly contagious disease at 64%. Yes, the common cold, a type of coronavirus in fact. The larger circle was this seemingly new, novel and terrifying COVID-19 at 80%, which made the others vanish by comparison. Worse, it was nearly 10 times more lethal than the flu. Perhaps it was the work of some dubious gain-of-function experiment in a Chinese laboratory after all, because it certainly did not seem like a viral concoction of Mother Nature. I finally found someone in Sweden who disagreed with the Swedish strategy. It had been no easy task. I found her confident and fearless in expressing what in Sweden was a very unpopular minority view. If I was the Swedish President, Prime Minister, what would you like to say to me right now?
That's a good way to put it. I would like to ask him, how does he feel comfortable playing this game with us when the whole world is acting differently? That many people go around and they are very satisfied that Sweden is acting in a different way now, and they are even proud because we are the odd ones out. But
that's an interesting point. Why are you the odd ones out?
Because here we are taking it easy, kind of, and there is almost, compared to other countries, there are almost no restrictions. Like coffee shops, restaurants, shopping centers, schools, everything is open. So here people can still live a pretty normal life, and they feel so good about that. And that's why people start idolizing Anders Tegnell, who is the face of all of this. And they say that he is our our savior, exactly. They go around with t-shirts with his face on it and messages. So I can
like a cult figure.
Exactly. And we who have these groups, we usually get so upset about that because it seems that only us think about people who died, actually.
Yeah.
And those who go around idolizing Anders Tegnell and the government for doing this in such a different way, they only talk about how good it is that they are not exaggerating, how good it is that we can still live our lives here.
But they aren't actually. There are people who've lost relatives or parents. Your colleague here has lost her father to COVID-19. And I guess you feel it's like a mathematical approach and like a casino gamble, when actually, you know, if the measures are more serious, your father might still be here.
Exactly.
I mean, have you got a story? What's your story? How did you find yourself as part of this group?
Yeah, the thing with me is that I didn't have any tragedy yet, but I work in a preschool.
In a preschool?
Yeah, and it's just...
Which is open?
Yeah, it's open and it's a scandal, actually. It's at least a scandal waiting to happen because the kids are just going around being like they are, and we have nothing that we can do to prevent and to protect them.
Have you had any serious illness or deaths even, God forbid, at your school?
No.
But you know presumably people in other schools that have had deaths?
Yes. In many schools, not deaths yet. One teacher already died. That was not in a preschool, but it was in a school. But
are we talking Stockholm or the whole of Sweden?
I think the teacher died here in Stockholm. But the thing is that many people are taking their own precautions. Many parents are leaving their kids at home.
Yeah.
And that is actually what's helping this whole situation. Because if everyone would 100% follow only the restrictions that we have now in Sweden, then the situation would be much worse. The good thing is that people are taking their own precautions.
They're taking children out of the school.
Exactly.
If they've got COVID-19, they'll take them out of the
and
school.
even if they are not having any, because they are scared. So they refuse to send the kids to school. So now they're being threatened by the schools, actually.
Yeah, I see. How deadly or lethal do you think COVID-19 is? How serious a disease is it? Do you know much about the science of it? Or have you got an opinion?
I have an opinion, but it's like everyone always says in this country that you shouldn't talk if you're an expert. That's always what they say. But I think that it's true that it's not very, very dangerous if you're young and healthy. But of course it can happen that you die from it, even if you don't have underlying diseases. So I don't see why people should take a risk when we actually don't know anything about this virus.
I warned to her. She was standing up for what she believed. and had the courage of her convictions. I thought it interesting how groupthink meant that she had been stuck by the Swedish majority with the "you're not a scientist" label to shut her up.
I think that that's the argument that many people are using, because they are getting annoyed that people are exaggerating. But the thing is that I would rather exaggerate and then think like this: okay, I exaggerated. I would rather that than take it easy and then be lying in some hospital bed and think, why didn't I take more precautions?
Yeah.
You know, the thing is that this thing is spreading very fast, and everyone said, oh, it's going to stop in China. Oh, okay, it didn't stop in China. Okay, then it's going to be in Europe a little bit, and then it spread all over Europe, and now it's in the US, and it's everywhere now. So it's obvious that we cannot have control over this disease.
What about the economic impact? Because certainly in the UK right now, where I'm from, there is an argument that, fine, we're saving some lives now, but the economic impact will, for example, mean that there's no money for the health service, and that we'll therefore lose the same or not more lives in the future by locking businesses down. Do you have a view about that?
I agree with that. I mean, I understand that concern, of course, but the thing is that I think that it's still better that we try to save people, even if the economy is going to take a hit by it. Because, I mean, there's no country in the world that can hide from the depression that's coming. So it's going to be a disaster anyway. And yeah, I mean, the economy is already screwed up. And of course it would be better to, I think that's what they're trying to do with Sweden. They're trying not to screw up the economy, and they are offering some lives in return. And what we are going to end up with is a lot of dead people, and still the economy is going to be screwed up.
So that's
I think so.
It's worth saying, because the deaths from the disease will always outweigh any deaths from the economic.
Yeah, exactly. It's also about how people die. That's what I've been saying all along. Because let's say I have a business and I lose my business because of this whole crisis, and then I suicide. At least I had a choice, right? I wanted to kill myself. But her dad, for example.
Yeah, what was his story?
He was healthy. He was 63, and he was totally healthy. And then he died in 5 days. It just happened.
No.
He had been having cold symptoms for a few weeks, and then he went to the hospital, and then in 5 days he died. So he didn't get any choice.
She felt that any damage to the economy was a price worth paying. But I imagined a doctor in a field hospital, dedicated to saving the lives of soldiers in a battle and calling for urgent help. Maybe the general sends ships with extra troops. But what if those same ships deprive the army of essential supplies in other critical areas? A difficult decision. She also felt it was right to lock down merely because we did not know the degree of the danger. This rather felt like being spooked by imaginary shadows when efforts might be better directed to throwing a light on the situation. Had the experts lit the way for our leaders?
Let's just get straight into what I just began starting with, which is what Professor Giesecke was telling us last week. So he essentially is of the view that the paper you guys produced on March the 16th was wildly over-pessimistic, that the 510,000 mortality figure would never have happened anyway, and that the 250,000 dead figure for a mitigated approach was also overly pessimistic. So he was quite critical of your paper, and I just wanted to give you the chance to respond directly. What do you make of what he was saying, and what do you make of the Swedish policy more generally?
Yeah, well, maybe I'll talk about the Swedish policy. I mean, I know Johan quite well. We disagree, and I would say the majority of epidemiologists would support my position. Sweden has taken its own course. I mean, the epidemic in Sweden is interesting in the sense that they clearly have slowed spread with voluntary social distancing. And we think that has actually brought this key number, the reproduction number, which probably starts at about 3, down to 1.5, 1.4 there in Sweden. That slowed the trajectory, but Sweden is still seeing day on day, well, with a lot of weekend effects, day on day increases in deaths and cases. And so the real issue is they're at a point now where their per capita mortality in Stockholm is approaching New York. Clearly a policy decision for the Swedish government whether they wish to tolerate that, but I don't think it's a decision most other countries have made, clearly.
I felt the interviewer had posed the questions of the estimate very well, but was a little disappointed that Dr Ferguson seemed disinclined to answer and instead drifted off onto another discussion of the Swedish policy and why they were wrong for not doing what everybody else was doing.
The other aspect of the your March model that Professor Giesecke was querying was essentially the difference between what the outcome would get with a so-called mitigated strategy versus the outcome with a suppression strategy, because your model gave a number of potentially 250,000 deaths if we did a mitigated strategy, which seems similar to roughly what they're doing in Sweden, whilst it might be reduced to sort of 20,000 range if we do a full suppression. Isn't this the evidence of what we see in Sweden, where it may be higher than its neighbours in Scandinavia, but it's certainly not 12 times higher than we've seen in the UK. In fact, it's lower than what we've seen so far in the UK in terms of deaths per capita. Isn't that evidence that the results with the mitigated strategy might have been better than you forecast?
I mean, to be clear, Sweden are not adopting a mitigation strategy, and they're denying they are. They have much more social distancing in place than we modelled for a mitigation strategy. The point of a mitigation strategy is you go through the epidemic, you get herd immunity, you lift measures quite quickly. We estimate Sweden, as I said before, have got more than half the reproduction number. So that's a lot more than mitigation. It means that they will eventually see the epidemic come down if they keep the current measures in place, but they won't have reached herd immunity. And indeed their own estimates say they're not, and they state themselves that's not their goal. What they have is a sort of semi-suppression strategy.
So Sweden was following a semi-suppression strategy. But in which case, why weren't we following a semi-suppression strategy, I wondered? Had he even modelled it? No, it appeared. He had concluded in his report that suppression is the only viable strategy at the current time. The report had surprised me by the strength of its recommendations. It was all or nothing, it seemed, lockdown or a deathly doom. Right at the top, in the opening remarks, he declares that this is the worst pandemic since the Spanish flu of 1918. Or even worse, at least in terms of the spread of the virus, he had estimated 80% would become infected, whereas the Spanish flu was only 33%. And this needed to be set in the context of far worse hygiene conditions during a time of trench warfare, large-scale troop movements, and packed hospitals with very little social distancing. Where had his 80% figure come from? Outside, I found a British ITN news crew in a far greater state of fear than the Swedes. I chatted briefly with the presenter, but when I stepped forward, he abruptly backed away and cried, 2 metres. The UK government's medical advisor wielded great power indeed if he could fill people with such fear. Now, fearful myself, I decided to get a COVID-19 health drink. Yeah, I missed that bit. How do you say cheers?
Skål. Skål.
Skål. Had the government relied entirely on Dr Ferguson, or had it taken peer-reviewed advice elsewhere? For instance, the SAGE Advisory Committee was formed of many other experts. But when I looked at the minutes of the meetings over the critical dates between the 16th and 23rd of March, there was something of a gap. Previously, they had been following a strategy similar to Sweden, but after the production of the report, the minutes seemed to suggest the talk was all of suppression. So presumably they had been silenced by the production of Ferguson's impressive work. He was a man of some standing and reputation. But was there no brave soul amongst them to cry out, "Are you really saying this is as bad as the Spanish flu?" To my surprise, I now stumbled on some news articles and discovered that there was a dissenting view, and that another equally reputable epidemiologist, Sunetra Gupta of Oxford University, had come up with a different report from Imperial College at around the same time. She felt that a considerable number of people had already been infected, but not with serious symptoms, and that this might bring the fatality rate down from 1% to as low as 0.2%, 5 times less. I started to wonder whether Dr Ferguson might have a prior history of overestimating forecasts, and it was then I stumbled on this rather curious story. It appeared that back in the 90s, Neil Ferguson had originally been part of the Oxford University group, but then a certain Professor Anderson had created a drama when he accused Sunetra Gupta, who had been voted in for a readership, of having had an affair with one of the people who had voted her in. He later apologised, but the scandal meant he was voted out of office, and so it was he set up a separate team at Imperial College. He took Dr Ferguson with him. Professor Anderson already had the ear of the government, and so too Dr Ferguson now became a rather important figure. During the course of 20-odd years of health scares and epidemics, he then made the following predictions. During the 2001 outbreak of foot and mouth disease, he predicted that up to 150,000 people could die. There were fewer than 200 deaths. In 2002, he predicted that between 50 and 150,000 people would likely die from exposure to BSE in beef. In the UK, there were only 177 deaths. Of his work on BSE, Professor Ferguson said, "Yes, the range is wide, but it didn't actually lead to any change in government policy." In 2005, Dr Ferguson predicted that up to 200 million people could be killed from bird flu. In the end, only 282 people died worldwide from the disease between 2003 and 2009. Ferguson told The Guardian that around 40 million people died in 1918 from the Spanish flu outbreak. There are 6 times more people on the planet now, so you could scale it up to around 200 million people probably. In 2009 there was the swine flu crisis. A government estimate based on Ferguson's advice said a reasonable worst-case scenario was that swine flu would lead to 65,000 British deaths. In the end, swine flu killed 457 people in the UK. Professor Ferguson was then an advisor to the government and the World Health Organization, and he sounded the alarm over swine flu, warning that it could cost up to 4 million lives globally, and floating a study on the antiviral benefits of closing all UK schools. In the end, schools mostly stayed open, and the worldwide death toll was 18,500. Well, I feel ostracised or alienated in a lot of ways these days. I've just been shunted out of the coffee shop outside seating area for the dodgy cigarette, unfortunately. You've got to stand 5 metres away from any part of the restaurant or the coffee shop's kind of territory. So, yeah, I got a ticking off from the barista. But it was smoking that actually led to my next interview, as a lady on a bicycle stopped me and asked for a cigarette. As I opened up my cigarette case, little did she know that she was being lured into an interview.
My name is Maria.
Maria, please meet
Yes.
Maria. And you are perhaps the most important member of Dr. Anders Tegnell's family.
Yes. No, yes, actually I am. Yeah.
Tell me about how you feel about Mr. Tegnell.
You know, I like him.
Come on. That's not what you said before the camera started running.
Okay, but you know, that's because I saw him so many times on TV.
Okay.
And he seems to be a very good person.
Sure.
Sure.
So you have he has a special place in your heart?
Yes.
Yeah, no, that's good.
He do.
From there. And what do you think? Is the coronavirus deadly?
Yes.
And would you like to explain why you think it is deadly?
Especially when you're old, then it's deadly.
Okay, so what you're saying is, I'm a lawyer, so I'm annoying. I ask these
Okay,
horrible
okay.
questions. So what you're saying is, it's deadly for old people.
Yes.
So it's not deadly for everyone.
No.
Is it deadly for all old people? What about healthy old people?
Yeah, but it could be.
Because the Italian health minister, Italy is one of the worst hit places, said that the coronavirus, the average age of deaths is around 80, and most of those have underlying medical conditions, and many have 2 or 3 underlying medical conditions.
Yeah.
So I think I'm being like, I feel that it is deadly for old people with underlying medical conditions.
Yes.
So that brings us on then to the steps. How effective, do you agree with the steps the government has taken?
Yeah, but as we talked before, I think it's important that I think maybe we should have done more in the beginning, and I think Anders regrets that too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because that's a really interesting point. Would you like to say what they didn't do and what they
No, they
could
should have locked it or said no visitors to elderly care homes, and they should have done that.
Because we were saying earlier that Dr Anders Tegnell has said that 50% of all the deaths in Sweden have actually occurred quite early on.
Yeah.
Perhaps even before the crisis began, they were infected with the coronavirus.
Yes.
So what about closing the borders and closing shops, restaurants and all of that? What's your feeling on that side of things?
Maybe they should have closed more like this to go out on a ferry, and stuff like that.
Grouping together.
Grouping,
in large
yeah,
groups.
it was a lot of that in the beginning.
Yeah.
And maybe we were not so fast. So maybe that spread, and then it spread to elderly care and like this.
Yeah, so that's an interesting point, because it does feel in the West that a lot of countries have gone extreme on the lockdown, but actually we have an expression in English, the horse had already bolted. It's like trying to close the stable door after the horse has bolted. And maybe, earlier steps would have actually would have been far more effective than any steps. Because then you have either a lockdown or you have the steps that have been put in place by the Swedish government, and you kind of feel damage has been done already.
Right. Yeah. So I think it's not good to lock everything down, but maybe to take more care of the elderly.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's an interesting point, because another question I've had whilst making this documentary is, why now? Why haven't we been looking after the elderly for the last 10, 15 years? You put them in care homes, they die of flu.
Yeah, right.
And why do you think it's suddenly such a big issue in 2020 and it hasn't been before?
I don't know. Maybe it's stupid that we haven't taken more care of them.
I'm asking sincerely.
I
this is a mystery for me.
Yes. I think maybe we will, after this corona, we will take more care of them, be more aware.
And that's a good thing.
Yeah.
That's actually a good thing that could come out of it all.
Right.
It? I wonder, I still have this question of why did it all happen?
Yeah.
Is it politicians who are using their powers to please the people, to ensure that they get re-elected? Is it big business? Is it corporations? Is it Bill Gates trying to sell vaccines or make all the world poor so they can be richer?
Right.
Is it increasing the gap,
Yeah.
the poverty gap? Is it the press out of control, feasting on misinformation and panic, creating panic and hysteria? I was interviewing someone in 7-Eleven just up here
Right.
this
Okay.
week,
Yeah.
and there was a homeless guy, a very cheerful homeless guy, whose job is to pick up litter and tin cans.
Yes. Right.
But he doesn't now because there's no tourists. And he said, I said, what do you think of are you scared of the coronavirus? He said, yes, I'm terrified. I said, oh, why is that? He said, well, yesterday I read a newspaper, your evening news,
Yes.
and it said that it's attacking the immune system.
Right.
It was a big headline splashed across.
So I think they should do more about the homeless too. But instead they are making a home for like people that live very narrow in some Järva field or some places in Sweden. They put them into like so they could be more distance.
Yeah.
But they don't do enough for the homeless.
Yeah.
And they are, in a risk. Some of them are not well or not.
Well, that's a good point. The old
Yeah.
homeless.
Right.
That's and they are walking around and
Yeah.
they should be looked up. Yeah, that's a good point. I haven't
Yeah.
heard anybody talk about the old homeless people.
No. I don't understand this. But maybe
Well, the press aren't interested in it, maybe.
I don't know, but I don't know if why we're not doing more. But maybe it's because we are a very like individualistic country and think about ourselves, or I don't know.
Well,
We care about the elderly, but not so much about the homeless.
it's interesting, isn't it? I was just trying to imagine the headline, homeless people dying from COVID-19. It doesn't really work as a headline. If I'm a news editor, I want to major on old people in care homes with illness
Yeah.
that are dying in their numbers,
Right.
or young people are dying, or kids are dying. But where do I go with a homeless person died? It's
I don't know.
interesting, isn't it?
It's
Why
interesting,
that's
but
not a.
maybe that's the next step that
that's
we will
the
think
next
about
step.
them. I don't know.
It
Maybe this is like in a way I'm proud of our country because we are doing things that are, scientific. They have been proven that this is good. We're not doing crazy things. But we should, if we are a scientific country that follow the rules, we should also take care of persons that could not help themselves, like the homeless.
Because there's a danger with the Dr. Anders Tegnell approach of it being seen to be lacking in compassion.
Yes, maybe.
I'm not saying it is,
But
but there is that perception, I think. We're not doing enough, we're just following a strategy, we're accepting deaths, and maybe that makes people, maybe that's what makes him unpopular in other countries across the world.
right.
Because it's interesting what you say. I think the Swedish seem to be quite reasonable and rational.
Right.
For example, I learned during this adventure that in 1603 the king said the doctors will be a separate institution.
yes.
Government won't interfere with them. So you've depoliticised the health advisors to the government,
Right.
which is a good thing because
Yes.
they give independent advice, and that's very rational.
Right.
Whereas in the UK, we've had the health minister there is the doctor in charge of not the minister but the doctors who report to the government. You kind of feel they're politicised and they're following a party line, and there hasn't been any proper debate or conversation about it. So the strategy has happened.
But I've heard that the Englishmen, that you have to be so strict with them because otherwise they will not follow the rules. You have to be, no, you can't go out because that could be a danger with people that are just listening, and not understanding why.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Or is it like we have been in peace so many years that we don't have anyone to tell us what to do, so that will not work on us. I don't know.
Are we getting soft, do you think? Are we a bit soft about death?
Here in Sweden?
In the world? We feel a bit... one single life has got to be saved and we're just soft about it, sentimental.
Yeah, maybe. But this is also something with the corona. Before people were dying, as you say, in the flu or,
Yeah,
you know.
exactly.
So, and we were not doing anything.
No.
But now suddenly we were like,
We're back at the same question. Why now?
why now? But maybe it's like a wake up call to the whole world.
It's kind of a divine event.
Yeah, so this will be, in the end, after this, we will be better people.
God's way of giving us some
Right,
painful instruction.
yes. And hopefully we will learn something and be more careful about each other and not just think about ourselves.
My conclusions of Dr. Ferguson's report so far were that rather than shine a light on the situation, he had lit a fire. I decided it was now time to find a decent hotel and hole up for a few days while I tried to figure it all out. My brain was starting to hurt and numbers were running around my head like a herd of wild horses. The Haymarket seemed to be from a bygone era, which seemed fitting, insofar as I feared, rather melancholically, that our era was now coming to an end and would soon be demoted to its own bygone age. Was this to become a critical moment in modern history, in fact? Could it possibly be that this pandemic would turn out to be something of a damp squib? As melodramatic as it sounded, I wondered if, once the tide of panic and hysteria had withdrawn, we might be alarmed at the mangled flotsam and jetsam of our societies left lying in the mud. Bicycle Lady's words were still echoing in the back of my mind. There could be a danger from people just listening and not understanding why. Had we all been too ready to listen and to not ask the critical questions? Had we been following the science after all? I was still puzzled as to where the 80% infection rate and the 1% fatality rate had come from, and I had at this point been ticked off that I should try and track down the Nobel Prize winner Michael Levitt, who apparently had some rather interesting things to say about Dr. Ferguson's assumptions. So it was I would find myself once more turning to the curious story of the Diamond Princess cruise ship, which might yet turn out to be the critical clue to solving the mysterious affair of COVID-19.
People started getting a bit weird about it, and I was thinking to myself, what am I missing?